I'm here with James Priest. We are here in beautiful Barcelona for a deepening course of Sociocracy 3.0. James is one of the founders of Sociocracy 3.0. You're also going to be speaking on the FourSpaces Playground Conference in Munich next year, a little bit about this and about the mindset and principles of self-organized organizations. Now, maybe a lot of the people who will watch this video will have heard about Scrum and Agile in general. Maybe not everybody has heard about S3. So James, can you say very briefly what is Sociocracy 3.0 or S3 as we call it in the abbreviation?
Okay, well, so let's call it S3, but it has its history in sociocracy, the Sociocratic Circle method, which was basically a methodology developed from the 70s that focused around answering the question, what would it look like if people impacted by decisions are able to make and or influence those decisions? So it focused very much on the decision-making side of things in organizations, and also posited some ways for structuring organizations too. So I was quite excited about that from 2001 onwards, and increasingly shared about that methodology. But there were some limitations to it, and it was a whole system approach to organizational governance. And over time it became more and more clear that every context is unique and different people need different things in different moments. And I think Agile teaches us something about this in terms of an agile mindset, to look at developing things iteratively and incrementally in response to needs. So it enables something unique to emerge in each case, and emphasizes an inquiry for innovation and novelty. And S3 is basically a synergy between certain patterns, and what I mean by patterns is either like guidelines for behavior, or patterns of behavior where you can see people follow, or particular processes, or simply definitions for communicating and understanding in terms of different elements of collaboration. So from one perspective you could say it's a collection of observable patterns you can see people using to navigate the various issues they face in organizations, including in the complex domain. And the basic idea is that people can pull from that menu on an as-needed basis, in response to the organizational needs they face.
So it's like a menu of pattern that people can pull from. Okay. Why would you say S3 is now very necessary for today's world?
Well, I mean, the proposition that it's necessary is an interesting one to consider, because I suppose it depends very much on what outcomes we want to achieve. And some people might say that certain things are more necessary than others. So from the first point to consider then is that S3 is relevant for people in a case where they foresee that pulling in patterns are going to help them to achieve their objectives. And of course we all have very different objectives. So there's something quite fundamental about S3 that builds on the idea of identifying clearly what is needed in your context, and so in the context of organizational needs. So why is it necessary? Well, it's not if what you're currently doing and what you've currently got is good enough, considering your intended outcomes and the output you get from your endeavors are what you would expect or wish to see. And the moment S3 becomes relevant is in the case where, despite your best efforts and with what you currently have, the outcomes you're achieving don't match what you would desire or prefer to see. And then S3 offers some options to consider that, were you to pull them in and use them, then they might help you to have a better day and create more value with the time that you have. So on a wider level, I mean, why is that necessary? Well, the question really, I think, is are we content with the world that we have? Do we see room for improvement? Do we see that there are blind spots in how we do things, and there are cultural norms maybe that lead to consequences that are counter to what we would wish to see? And if that's the case, then are there changes we can make? Are there alternatives that might help us to better achieve the outcomes that we might believe are possible, but currently seem unable to attain?
Often at the same time, my observation is that a lot of organizations that use patterns of S3s, so they're in you mentioned that before. You said in the complex domain often. So that means in a space, in a situation where there's often uncertainty. It's not clear what the result will be.
Or even what the issue is.
Lots of dynamics.
Or if there is an issue.
So we could say a lot of the organizations who think about becoming more agile and using approaches of becoming more agile would also look at S3, and S3 would be an option for them to think about. Yeah,
sure. And I think there's a big consciousness already, at least in principle, around the idea of agile operations. So developing products and services in an agile way. But the notion of agile governance, how do you kind of make decisions and build on them iteratively and incrementally throughout the system in terms of how you actually steer or guide the flow of value in response to changing contexts and needs. I think this is where S3 brings an added dimension to people.
Now you just mentioned, on the agile operations part, most people would be familiar with Scrum, right? As a framework for developing products in an operational space. Now, if we look at what you called governance, so making decisions that then impact other decisions, a lot of people might have heard about Holacracy as they would call it an organizational operating system. How does S3? Could you say how is S3 different from, for example, Holacracy, or how does it go beyond that, or what would be a major difference here?
Well, one thing about Holacracy is it's a whole system approach. So, as far as I understand, if you don't pull in all of Holacracy, then you're doing something else and not Holacracy. So there's a belief in the interdependency of the different elements of Holacracy, and you should do them all.
So it's all
together.
in, right?
It's all in, yeah. So that's one big difference, because S3 says don't change anything unless it's broken and you would like to do something different. So in that sense, you just pull in whatever it is that might be helpful. Another thing I think that's distinct between Holacracy and S3 is that Holacracy was very much inspired by Endenburg's thinking and the Sociocratic circle method, and there's two principles that are particularly relevant to answer the question. One is equivalence, and another is this idea of consent. And what consent means is it's like a safety check to make sure what you're doing isn't going to lead to consequences you would prefer not to see, and or to double check, is what we're currently doing or what's proposed, can that be improved? Were we to kind of consider somebody's argument or perspective on that? And the equivalence element is to ensure that people who are impacted by decisions have the power to raise objections, the opposite of consent, when they see a reason to do so. And Holacracy, I think, tried to get around some of the ambiguities around how you distinguish what's a valid kind of argument or objection to something and what's more kind of personal preference, by putting together a kind of a tick box list of criteria for when somebody can stand in the way of somebody else's proposal, an idea of how to respond to an organizational need. Another thing I think is that there's no patterns for co-creation in Holacracy, so it very much emphasizes the individual and gives agency to the individual, whereas in S3 there are also patterns that are based on the premise that sometimes tapping the diverse perspectives of various stakeholders and synergizing that can lead to a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. So it quite explicitly would advocate for some kind of collaborative process of proposal forming and decision making were that the case. There's one other thing, and I forget what it is right now.
Okay, well, maybe it'll come back to us and we'll bring it in.
Let's see if it comes back.
So in the last, I think it's my fourth learning experience that I'm having with you now, and in the past years, actually, there has been quite a community that has been building worldwide in different countries of S3 practitioners. They're networking with each other, trying to support each other. You're also developing resources to support the community. What do you envision the future of that community in a few years down the road?
Well, one answer to that is I've got no idea, actually. I don't really have a sense of what the future might look like. What I see, my kind of the focus isn't so much on a community of people pulling in S3, but it's more a growing community of people who are interested in how to create better organizations. And when I say better, I mean on two fronts. One on like more value out for the energy put in, but also more humane organizations where people have a sense of meaningfulness and engagement and ownership over what it is that's happening. And why I think that's relevant is because, from my perspective, ultimately the purpose of us cooperating together is because we can better serve our own and one another's needs through cooperation and going things alone. You know, it just makes it easier to achieve that. So this is what I see as a growing swell of people who are coming together and saying, okay, we're dissatisfied with what is, we anticipate we could do something different, and how might we go about doing that? And then S3 comes in along with many other practices, ideas, perspectives as well. And where do I see that going? Well, I'm not sure. It's like, on the one hand, there's a kind of expansion, opening into us realizing our potential as a species, and on the other hand, you could argue there's some contraction as well. And what's behind those two kind of quite polarized forces is hard to tell. It's probably an externalization of our own kind of openness and limitations in our own psyches manifest in the outer world. But what I like to think is that we will find ways to have greater impact together, not only by doing things together, but by creating environments that enable individuals to have more impact for themselves.
And with that aspect, so that's one thing that you will also touch upon in your keynote in the conference, in order to have a better impact and to co-create together. So one aspect that is very important is the decentralization of influence and decision making. Right? Can you just very briefly, as a kind of teaser, elaborate a little bit on this, why that is so important for better collaboration and better outcomes?
Yeah, I can. Okay, well, I think that might help me to remember the point I missed in terms of the difference between Holacracy and S3 as well, because what Holacracy endeavored to do was to make power explicit and to place it in a constitution. And as I understand, what Brian Robertson, who developed Holacracy, wanted to do was to impede the possibility of individuals taking power and using that over others. So putting it into a constitution makes some sense in that regard. So this question of power and what's happening with power in organizations is an important one. And in more egalitarian, pluralistic contexts where people often are coming from a wound of power over systems and trying to bring more fairness and more equality into the system, then power can become a tricky word to talk about. And that's particularly relevant in the context of S3, the narrative of S3, because we decided not to use the word power but to use influence instead. But what we really mean by delegate influence is delegating power or decentralizing power to influence through a system. And why that's important is because beyond one person, so anytime we cooperate with one other or more, then it makes sense that we distribute work and that each person has some agency to influence. And generally speaking, the more agency you have to influence and the more agency I have to influence, the better. There needs to be adequate coherence in terms of why we are influencing and what outcomes we're aiming to achieve, and enough feedback that were you to behave in a way that was contrary to what I believe we should be doing, then I can tell you that and you'll adjust your behavior. Right? So in order for organizations to grow in as complex adaptive systems to navigate complexity in the world, then they need to be able to respond rapidly to changing contexts. And you can't do that from a centralized point at scale.
You have to escalate up to make a decision.
And you can see it even in a typical like top-down organizational hierarchy, with like a management hierarchy. There's still agency of individuals to a degree, but the question is to what degree, and at what point can somebody override somebody else? And what we're aiming for in a decentralized system is to enable agency and autonomy as much as possible within clearly defined constraints that enable people both to respond for themselves and be resourced to do so, but also know where the line is when it's necessary or valuable to back up and talk to other stakeholders who might be impacted or have a valuable contribution to make. So it's inevitable in that. What I mean is it's a prerequisite for us to be effective and to navigate complexity in a way that's evolutionary and developmental. We have to decentralize power. Life does it all the time.
Okay. Yeah.
And how the question is, how do we go about doing that in a conscious way that adds value rather than impedes it?
Maybe that leads then to my last question. So if now an organization starts to think about using patterns of Sociocracy 3.0, or if they start trying to do more of this, what would you say would be maybe one of the biggest changes in terms of mindset that is required to use that successfully?
Well, I would say that we're the ones we've been waiting for. And what I mean by that is, very often people who are closest to the work have a pretty good idea about how to respond. And there's a tendency in all of us, I think, to look outside of ourselves for the answer. And there's value in that to a degree, because we can be inspired by others and we can learn from others and so on. But if each context is unique, and if the biggest mistake we can make in responding to complexity is to act with yesterday's thinking, then I think the prerequisite is to bring consciousness into the moment and what we're doing, to adequately acknowledge what we've learned ourselves and from others before, but also to take each situation on its own merit, and to ask ourselves in that moment, is what we currently have and know about this good enough to respond? And if not, then what shall we do instead? So it's really about, I think consciousness is fundamental.
Being aware of what you're doing and why you're doing things.
Awareness is a precursor to consciousness, but awareness doesn't change anything. I can be aware that I'm making mistakes and it's leading me in a direction I want to go to, and still leading me in a direction I don't want to go in, but I still continue doing it anyway. So it's not just about the awareness, it's about having the will to actually behave differently. And we've been exploring here in these days this idea that between the habitual and the new, the potential for greater consciousness resides. And largely speaking, we act out of unconsciousness, and that's a good thing, because there's enough to think about in the moment without having to think about everything again and again. But the problem with that is that in a moment when we're confronted by something new, we can easily project the past onto it and react to that in the ways we learned in the past, and that might be more or less appropriate in the moment. And the problem is expanded by the fact that that's not just one person in collaboration, but there's many of us doing the same thing. And we've all got very different habitual ways of doing things. So when we need enough coherence between us to create value together, there has to be some conscious inquiry into some kind of agreement around a good enough and safe enough way to proceed.
Thank you very much, James.
Pleasure. Thank you, Florian.